Arthur Rusty Brink.
Okay. Can you talk about your life? Can you talk about your life and family before the war?
Sure can. I grew up in eastern Massachusetts, born in Madison, Wisconsin. Grew up in eastern Massachusetts and went up to the University of Vermont, went up to Vermont to go to school at the University of Vermont, and was married right after college in 1966. Helen and I had a baby, Damon, before I went to Vietnam. I went into the service in 1969 and was on active duty for 2 years, and then 2 years I was on active reserve. Helen and I were divorced about 10 years after we were married, and I subsequently remarried, and Kathy and I now have 6 children and 5 grandchildren, and one grandchild due in March. So we have a great crew. 4 of the kids are in Vermont. 1 is in Rochester with 3 grandchildren, and we have another one down here, another couple down here in Florida. One of our sons, Justin, and his wife Julie live in Hollywood, actually in Dania Beach, and so we have them close, and that's really kind of nice. We see the kids all the time, and they're traveling down here or we're traveling up there. So that gives you the background of, quick background of my life before and after the war. When I went into the service as a second lieutenant, because I went from the University of Vermont, I went to graduate school for 3 years, and then I did my basic training, and as a second lieutenant, went in 1969, and a year stateside, stationed trained in Oklahoma, went to Fort Irwin, a military base in the desert, in the Mojave Desert in California, and then was reassigned, probably as a result of my master's degree, to go to Fort Gordon in Georgia. And so we came back across the country and spent 2 months in Georgia training in civil affairs. And then in July of 1970, and I knew this was going to happen because I was an ROTC student at the University of Vermont, so that provided income for me in my junior and senior year, and I knew that I would have to go into the service for 2 years and more than likely go to Vietnam. So in July of 1970, I was assigned to go to Vietnam and flew out of San Francisco to Vietnam. Interesting sidelight, though, when I was living on the East Coast and had to fly out of Oakland, California. So I flew across the country, and that was the era of hippies. There were a lot of war protests. Richard Nixon was president, and my brother was a hippie in Haight-Ashbury. Did you ever hear of Haight-Ashbury, April? No, you didn't. No, it was a pretty interesting place for a young second lieutenant to come in his uniform. Everybody had long hair and beads, and had a little pot that they could take some hits on. And my brother was there, and I spent the night drinking red wine and reciting poetry with an Irishman. As a consequence, I missed my plane to go to Vietnam and spent 3 days in the Oakland airport. So that was how I started my tour in Vietnam, and it was well worth it. My brother and I even though we were in different political worlds, we had a wonderful send-off. And interesting sidelight, I met my nephew for the first time, who was 6 months old, and he actually 15 years later came to live with me and my boys, and he's a very important part of our family now. So that was just a little interesting sidelight. You told me to tell some stories.
Can you discuss the process of going into the war?
Yes. As I stated a little bit earlier, I knew that I was going to have to go in the service because they had paid me for 2 years when I was a junior and senior at the University of Vermont. And so basically you try to get your life in order, living accommodations for, in this case, my wife, and I had a son that was 5 months old, was born in California. And my biggest preparation, although we did, there's two components. There's a component of the military training, which we did before I went in. And we did that at Fort Gordon, and we did it in Fort Irwin, California. But the other thing is the personal preparation about how do you deal with a separation from your family for 12 months. Leaving my five-month-old son was very hard, and that was, you know, going to war was easy compared to that. So anyway, we just had our uniform and a little duffel bag with a razor and shaving cream and a brush. You know, nothing else. That was all we needed. We got over there and they got us outfitted. So that was the preparation, the military preparation, getting ready, and then your family preparation. How are you going to communicate and stay in touch and stay linked, and with a couple of your dear friends as well, making sure you have the connections and you know how you're going to communicate. That was the era prior to cell phones. So we had to do special radio telephone operations, ham operators to communicate with the family whenever we had a chance, which wasn't too frequent. So letter writing and tapes were a very important part of that. And once I got in country, as we referred to it in Vietnam, Helen sent me a tape recorder and tapes so that we just sent them back and forth to one another, and I could stay with Damon as he developed.
Can you talk about the war and the jobs you had?
I was assigned to the 25th Division as I was a field artilleryman in the United States Army, and we provided support for infantry in the field, and we were based in what was known as Tui Tin Province, and I gave Armelia some of the maps to show the relationships. It was actually in the Dao Tiang Michelin rubber plantation, and the significant landscape was Nui Ba Den, which was a mountain outside of our post. It was we were surrounded by concertina wire, and it was a very small post, and we had our the 105 howitzers were in the field with each one of the infantry units. And then we had 8-inch howitzers on the base. And my job in that part of the war was to, I was what was known as a tactical operations center officer and 3 captains, because I was promoted to first lieutenant right after I got in country. We were in charge of the Tactical Operations Center, which directed all the firepower of the field artillery for the infantrymen. And we had everything charted on a map on a wall bigger than the wall behind you. And we knew where all the villages were. We had no fire zones. And we had infantry units marked. We had enemy units marked. So we knew where we could and could not fire the howitzers. And we basically gave directions to people in the field about where, when something happened, where they should fire their weapons to make sure we didn't injure any of the local population or our own troops. And I should mention, you know, part of this whole aura before coming into the war, Nixon was the president, and there was tremendous upheaval in this country. There were a lot of protests. Woodstock had happened when I went on active duty, and there was a lot of frustration and anger about the war in Vietnam. And it was interesting, I looked up some numbers before I came over, and bread was 36 cents a loaf then. Or gas was 36 cents a gallon compared to, what is it, 250, 260 now? And Nixon was the president, as I said earlier, but there was a lot of turmoil, so feedback that I was getting from my friends and family was very negative, and so that made it difficult for us in being in the country. So I did that in the southern part of the country after I was there, and I got there pretty much at the peak of the war. I think there were about 535,000 troops when I got into Vietnam in 1970. And then halfway through my tour, we started sending troops home, and Nixon had vowed to get out of Vietnam, and the Paris Peace talks were underway. And so anybody who had less than 6 months of service were reassigned to another unit, and my reassignment was to the 101st Airborne. And so I was transferred up north to the DMZ, and we were in what is known as Quang Tri Province. And we had a brigade headquarters there, and I was a brigade staff officer in civil affairs, which was a reflection of my civil affairs training in Georgia before I came in. And that was a much different job than working in the field artillery supporting the infantry. I had 3 Vietnamese, and by then I'd been promoted to captain. And I should mention, actually, before I go up to the 101st, when I was in the southern part of the country, even though I was only on active duty for 2 years, we had some problems with our leadership in our headquarters and service battery, and they asked me to take over as the commanding captain of 173 men, which was very unusual. That usually went to U.S. military academy officers as opposed to ROTC officers. But anyway, I did that for a couple of months, and it was a very rewarding experience. Went up north to 101st and brigade officer, and our job in the north part of the war zone was to engage in civil affairs, and with my 3 Vietnamese interpreters, we would fly out to a mountaintop by helicopter. The mountaintop would be, it was all mountainous. When in the south, in Tuy Tin province, it was all rice paddies. It was flat, a lot of water, rice paddies. When we went up north, a lot of mountains. And we would go to a mountaintop with just 5 or 6 of us, and maybe 10 infantrymen, all by ourselves with no protection, and we would broadcast, because they were in the south. We had Viet Cong, local villagers. In the north, we had North Vietnamese, well-trained regulars that we had to deal with, and we would broadcast from the mountaintop, telling them to go back to their mothers and their fathers and their spouses and their children, and Lord knows if that was effective or not. But every once in a while we would end up with a captive, and we would take that captive and fly him into civilization, because we were out in the jungles, and we would get a picture, give him some cigarettes, have a pretty Vietnamese woman next to him, and we get him to write something like, if you go home back to Hanoi, then you can be back with your sister and your mother, and then we'd print all these leaflets up and would fly them over the place where we thought the enemy troops were, and we'd just shower the area with these leaflets of some individual from the North Vietnamese Army who had given up, using him and a picture of him to encourage others to quit. And again, you don't really know how effective that was, but those are my 2 primary jobs when I was in Vietnam.
What was it like to actually be in sort of like a camp? Like, what was your base camp like?
We were all in bunkers because I would say, usually when I talk about this, I say that we had incoming every night that I was in Vietnam. That would mean 22 millimeter rockets or mortar shells that could be fired and then they could run away. So we lived in bunkers that were 14 by 14 inch beams, and we filled sandbags and we built them around it. So if you had if something exploded and you had fragmentation, it wouldn't do any damage. The sandbags would protect you. If you got a direct hit, it didn't matter what you had. You were, say goodbye. So and the camps were very rustic. In both cases, they were surrounded by barbed wire, and we would have sappers come through the wire frequently at night. Not to any major detriment, but it was an issue that we had to always deal with because we were on unprotected zones. In the South, we had villages around us, and so we had to be very sensitive to the operations around the villages. And we had some issues up north when as a brigade officer, where there were some accidents, and I would have to go out into the villages. We spent a lot of time doing education and health care for villages to try to win, as you hear now in Iraq and Afghanistan, the hearts and minds of the people. But everything was, we had 6 months of rain. It was cold and rainy, never stopped raining. Everything was wet the whole time. And then the dry season, it was humid and hot, and that was when the rice grew. So it was they had the economy built around that. But it was a pretty, it's not quite primitive. Some areas when we're in the field, when you're in the field, for example, when we were on the mountaintops, we had our rations that we used, which were, we call LRPs, and the name was Long Range Patrol Supplies, and they were basically just plastic packets that you poured water in, dehydrated, and we cooked them over C4, which is an explosive. And if you picked the C4 up and you threw it, it would explode. But if you just lit a match to it, it would burn and you could heat your food. And that's what we ate. And you had, when you got it, you had a roll of toilet paper, you had 4 cigarettes, and you ate or traded everything that you had in your ration, so nothing ever went to waste. So in the field, it was very primitive. There was, and we were, in fact, at night, we would guard our perimeter. There were no wires or anything. We would throw grenades down the hill just in case somebody had found us and was coming up the hill, and that was just a precaution. So all night long, we'd throw it. Our bedding was just, I still have my blanket from Vietnam. It was just a light nylon blanket, but was very warm, and that's what we slept on when we slept, when we were in the field.
So you had to work at all hours, like you know.
Right.
So it wasn't just a specific.
In the South, we had 12 on and 12 off, and we had 3 of us, and we just kept rotating around. When I was in the brigade staff, it was a little more normal, where it would be 12 hours. A 12-hour day, and then you just go about your daily business, whatever you had to do. If you went out into the field, if you were out there, we usually were not in the field for more than 2 nights because they would catch up to you, and so we didn't take that risk. So we kept moving as much as we could.
Can you talk about your final days in the war?
Well, everyone, we had a countdown, so everyone knew how many days they had left. Some people had very elaborate charts, and the language was sort of like 28 days and a wake-up. And then you hear people talking about that all the time. But every one of us had some technique, whether it was in a diary or on the wall, and there'd be an X through the date. So everybody knew when you were going to go. We had 2 times off. We had R&R, rest and recuperation, and you could go as far away as Hawaii. And I met my then wife, Helen, and we spent a week in Hawaii, which was absolutely magnificent. I had a great Fu Manchu mustache, and You know, she didn't recognize me at all, but that was great. That was wonderful. You could also do a 3-day weekend if you wanted to go to Thailand or Australia. But because of where I was stationed and what I was doing, I didn't feel comfortable taking that, so I never took advantage. I'm sorry I didn't do it now, but I didn't. But we did have a wonderful R&R in Hawaii, and so you just keep counting down the days and getting rid of stuff. You know, getting stuff to people that needed to, that wanted it or needed to have it. Wrapping up your responsibilities. We got on the plane. It's about a 17-hour plane ride, as I recall, and we usually had to stop. I think we stopped in Anchorage in Japan, one direction or the other. But I remember when we landed in Oakland, in California, you could explode the plane from the cheering when the wheels touched down, and you could hear that, and everyone just yelped because you never knew what was going to happen, and you were only safe when you finally got home.
How long were you personally in the war?
Almost 12 months. Yeah, and that was pretty normal tour. 12 months would be a normal tour, short of somebody signing up. There were a lot of folks who were career military, and they would sign up for 2, 3 tours, and they keep coming back. But I was a 2-year person, and that was my tour, and I was going back to, at the time I was teaching and coaching and working in fundraising at the University of Vermont, and that was the job that I was going to go back to.
People that ended up leaving the war, did they have any like anxiety towards, did you see any people with like an anxiety or like a traumatic event?
Absolutely. We saw that a lot, and there's probably a lot we didn't see, but as a commander with the 25th Division Artillery, the headquarters and service battery, I had a couple of medics who had a drug problem, and they were shooting up behind their knees, so you couldn't, because we only had t-shirts, and we wore long pants, so if you'd see any tracks on their arms, and they were good. They were really good medics. They just got out of control, and they got themselves in trouble, and we had to put them in a hospital and work with them to try to get them better. But there were other situations where we had problem where people would leave a grenade someplace and say, well, if you don't do this, then we're going to get your ass. And so there were those issues. The thing that was more impressive, however, was the dedication and commitment of most of the people that were there. And there were a lot of people who didn't want to be there. There were a lot of people who were angry, and there were a lot of people that acted out. But there also were the preponderance of the people that were there to try to, when you're in that setting, your focus is on the person on your right and your left. And nothing else in the world matters. And so, and that's just, no one can tell you about what it's like. You can be under attack and be in an environment with the people that you're there with, and just only concerned about what happens next, and how do you survive what's happening. Personally, I would never want to leave the students or anybody who saw this tape with the impression that I was a frontline warrior. I was an artilleryman, so I was behind the lines. The infantrymen, for every infantryman in the field, we had 6 in the rear. We called them rear echelon mother, that other word. And I won't say that because of you, April, but you know, that's what the rest of us were. You know, the infantry guys were out slogging, facing ambushes and leeches and bad environment. The rest of us, for all intents and purposes, lived in relative comfort. And I would put myself, even being out in the field, I would put myself in that bracket, so I wouldn't want anyone to get the wrong impression, even though we had incoming every night because we always were in forward bases. But the key was focusing on who was there, and no matter what your attitude was about the war, that we had to get through this together. And that's not to say there weren't people that didn't act out bad stuff.
Do you still have any friends from the war?
I haven't, you know, I haven't done that well. I made connections the first 10 years after I was out, and then I lost track of people. The interesting thing, though, is I found myself in the last 2 years doing research on the 101st and the 25th Division websites because the computers are so helpful now, but I haven't tracked anybody that I was personally friends with. What I have seen, most of the people my age, and I'm 66, so most of the people my age, the people around them, their age, didn't go to the war. So you don't sit around and talk about it. In my family, always, and one of the reasons I wanted to do this is because my family wanted to know about the kinds of things that you're doing. And I haven't talked with them like I'm talking with you, and that's my understanding. It's a pretty common criticism of veterans, but you know, the point is that there are times when I run into somebody and someone says something, and you get into a conversation about who you were with, where you're stationed, what you went through, but they're not friends. I mean, they are now friends, but they're not friends that I kept from the war.
How did your family react to you coming home from the war?
Well, we were just thrilled. The issue was again around my youngest boy, Damon, who was now 17 months old, and he didn't know who I was. So I had to come from California. I don't remember where I flew. I came in California. I must have come back to New York maybe, or Boston, and then I flew up to Burlington. So I came down the plane. We didn't have jetways then, I guess. I just remember going up and down the stairs of the plane, and so I came down, and Helen and Damon were at the bottom of the stairs, and the little guy was holding her hand, and you know, I was thrilled to see her. Obviously, we communicated all the time, but Damon was really standoffish. He didn't know who I was, and we had talked about this coming in through letters and tapes, and I just had to be careful not to go too fast, and that was very hard. And very hard for him. He can't remember any of it now. He's 40 now, so he can't remember any of that as it was. And we, fortunately, were able to build a wonderful relationship. Unfortunately, shortly thereafter, our marriage came apart, and so Helen and I separated, although to this day we remain very good friends and spend a lot of time together with our kids.
Do you have any any other stories, maybe stories you found funny or interesting?
Yeah, I can. I mean, we could sit here and talk for ages. This was the era of Sly and the Family Stone, and we would get together when we were off duty and drink beer until we floated, and we'd be singing and hugging and crying and laughing, and it again gets back to that camaraderie, even in an area where there are difficult issues. I got dengue fever when I was up north, which is I guess kind of like a mosquito bite, and I was going to work one day and I felt really dizzy and I collapsed halfway there, and I was medevaced out of the field, and I had to go down to Da Nang, which was a big air base. So I was in the hospital there, I think, for 5 or 6 days. I don't remember how long. I didn't know if I was going to die or what was going to happen, but it was nothing more than a bad fever. And that was when I was there. Lola Falana had come over, and she was entertaining the troops, and so we had a bunch of people there. I couldn't go because I was too sick, but that was that was a wonderful occasion. We had another situation where we sent the 25th Division home because we were starting to wind down the war, and so we moved out of the rubber plantation down to what was known as Long Bin, just outside of Saigon, and there were just miles and miles of vehicles that we had to turn in that had to be accounted for. So if you had 10 Jeeps, there was a guy, and they'd count Jeep 1, Jeep 2, and they'd just check them off. And I can't tell you all the stories, but there were, getting all of that to happen, and we got everybody some time off once we got out of the field to Long Bin. We got them some time off so they could go in and see Saigon, and everyone spent at least a night in Saigon. And we managed it pretty well. No one got thrown in jail or got in trouble, so we were happy to be able to do that and have that experience. The thing that impressed me was the industry of the Vietnamese people. If you could see them in those rice paddies that were flooded, and they would come with the baskets of rice, and they just would reach them down, put them in, and then the fields would dry up over the next few months, and that rice would grow, and they'd come back out and harvest. Very primitive, or there'd be a guy on an irrigation, I called it an irrigation bicycle, but they actually had little, I don't know what you call them, but they had buckets that were hooked up to a bicycle, and they could move water from one paddy to another paddy at different levels, and they just ride the bicycle, and then this little thing would go around and bring the water from this area and bring it up to another area. The Vietnamese people, my perspective on the Vietnamese people at that time, and I think it's probably still true today, they had a couple of interests. They were interested in venerating their ancestors, very closely knit families, and living in peace in their village. You know, in terms of the threat from communism or coming across the DMZ, they were very village-centric in how did they preserve their family ties. And like most places, the urban and the rural conflict is very strong, and when people ran out of the ability to generate a living in the rural settings, they would go to the urban settings to try to do that. But I found in my life that I've had the ability to learn from everybody that I have met, and I found that to be true in Vietnam. They're built just like you and I are, and there is nothing honorable or pretty about war, and we have to realize that everybody is interested in preserving their own family. They have their own pride, their own systems, and we may not agree with it, but the lesson is that, and not everybody believed this, but the lesson for me was that we needed to honor and respect the differences that we had with the Vietnamese. And it's true for the Iraqis and true for the Afghanis as well, Afghanistanis.
What is your life like today? How is everybody impacted today, thinking about it?
I mean, I have a wonderful life. I have people I love, and I have people that love me. We have a wonderfully big family, and so every day is a joy. I work at Martin Memorial Hospital. I do fundraising for the hospital, and I just consider myself to be very, very fortunate in the experiences that I've had in life and the fortune that I've had in life. And my wife today, we've been together for almost 30 years, Kathy and I, just about every day try to say thank you for our good fortune, and we're lucky to have the love and affection and support from our family. So I'm thrilled, and I think that I learned a great deal in Vietnam, and we all have to bear a certain amount of challenges in our life, and that was a challenge for me, but I like to think that I grew and learned from it, as painful as it could be. And the fact is, I came out of it, you know, and so I'm fortunate as the dickens.
To finish up, do you have any advice for anybody? I mean, people going into the war, just anything to students?
Well, I think first of all, I believe very strongly in a national volunteer service program. So I would say to all the young students, I would support, and I would support the idea of every student, every young person in this country has to serve 2 years for their country. Don't have to go to war. Could be in the Peace Corps, could be in VISTA, could be Teach America, could be in the military service, but I believe that we should have a 2-year policy. So that I would say to the South Fork Bulldog students that as you go forward in life, I mean, you're our young people, you're our future. If you look at the potential you have to give back to your country, and I do believe that this is a great country with great opportunity, but there are some that are more fortunate than others, but all of us are in the same boat, and so we need to I had a football coach who used to say, hang together like a bunch of grapes. And you know, you got to do that, and it's easy for us to see people that are different and say, well, I don't want anything to do with that person, I'll just deal with these people over here. So I believe in 2 years of active service, and I don't feel strongly that we need to have a volunteer army, or we have to have an army that where we have people that are recruited to go, but you know, we can make that decision as we go forward. But if people are going in the army and or in the service and they're going to be in a war zone, they have to be prepared for what's ahead in terms of the potential of losing their life or someone around losing their life, and that no matter what happens, when we come out of it, there are other people that are left behind that maybe didn't make it through as well that we need to try to help out.
Are there any other comments you'd like to add to your video?
No, I would just say to April and Nico, thank you, and thank you for your team doing the project and giving me this opportunity to share my thoughts. I also would like to say a special acknowledgement to my family, my wife Kathy, and the grandchildren. You know, we've got Justin, Sonny, Damon, Caroline, Sean, and Katie, and all of our 5 and soon to be 6 grandchildren, that I love you very much, and I hope that in some way, shape, or form this will have some impact on your life. I don't know who said it, but freedom isn't free. And so if we want to realize and maintain the freedoms that we have in America, we are going to have to make some sacrifices in order to maintain those. And they could be political, could be war related, whatever it is, but each one of us in our own way has to hopefully recognize that, and then in some way find a way to make a meaningful impact as they go forward.